When you picture the hero of Kvatch, what comes to mind? Maybe you think of a brave knight, a bold and strong warrior that wields a two-handed weapon and dons heavy armor. Perhaps you think of a stoic wizard, a caster that relies on the schools of magicka to get them through Cyrodiil's trials. Or maybe you think of some kind of rogue, a shadowy figure that uses stealth and fights from afar. We've all played as these classes, even a combination of two or even all three. However, I bet what you don't envision is the everyday commoner, just an average guy in Cyrodiil who's trying to get by. Some might call him the hero of the working class. He's not strong, he doesn't use magic, he doesn't even know how to fight. This peasant isn't an adventurer, and he's certainly never taken a life before. In today's video, I wanted to see if I could answer the question, can you make an honest living in the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion? Really, the question is more so, how would you go about doing it from a roleplay perspective? What are the ways you can earn some gold and put in your fair share for Cyrodiil society? This of course excludes murdering, fighting, and stealing, even in the name of being good. It's everything that the hero of Kvatch would probably do, and therefore, the common man won't, at least for the most part. So, without further ado, let's build our law-abiding normal citizen from the ground up. Let's see just how far Peter the Peasant can make it in this cold, brutal world. First things first, it's time to literally create Peter. Normally, I like to turn my characters into abominations. I put them under the knife, and they come out looking like Floops Fooglies from Spy Kids 1. However, for Peter, I think a generic appearance would be better off for him. He wouldn't hypothetically scare any shopkeepers or quest givers. Next, I chose to make him an Imperial. One of the reasons was so I could get access to his greater power, Voice of the Emperor. But spoiler, I never ended up using it, as the speechcraft checks ended up going really well. The other RP-based reason was so that Peter would blend in with the rest of the riffraff. It's his home turf, and in theory, he'd know where the best shopkeepers, farms, and jobs are. Next, let's move into Star Sign. There really wasn't anything that benefited personality or luck. The signs either boost the three main classes or add some obscure game-altering power to your character. For Peter, he didn't need any of that. Out of desperation, I was really close to choosing the Thief sign. Those buffs to agility, speed, and luck would have been great. However, as much as I'm going to sound like an obnoxious parent, my son is no thief, sort of. In the end, I ended up going with the Steed. The plus 20 stat boost to speed would actually really come in handy. Then finally, it was on to creating a class. For the specialization, I went with Stealth as it governs Speechcraft and Mercantile. For the attributes, I picked Personality and Luck. I can honestly say that I've never ran with a character who had this pairing before, so this should be interesting. Then for skills, there are a bit of hear me outs here. The obvious ones were Acrobatics, Athletics, Speechcraft, and Mercantile. To me, those were obvious picks, necessities for Peter to just exist in modern-day Cyrodiil. Then, I decided to go with Alchemy and Armor. My thinking is that everyone needs a trade. If you're not an adventurer, you've got to hone your skills in something else. The idea was that Peter would find armor, repair it, and sell it to merchants for a good chunk of change. Then for Alchemy, the concept was that Peter would find ingredients, or even buy them, create potions, and then sell them back to alchemists at a higher price. Honestly, I still love this idea, but spoiler, I didn't actually end up using those skills, as I found more lucrative ways of making money. Then finally, skill number 7 was a bit of a throwaway. My Peter would never use lockpicks, he doesn't know how to fight, and while he can sneak, he's not that good at sneaking. So I just went with light armor, cause when you think about it, that just means he's really good at wearing light armor. Anyways, it was a skill that never even saw the light of day. Once ready, the Just a Guy class was all set to go. Exiting the sewers, the world was now my oyster. Sort of. Peter was ready to stay safe at most times and earn an honest living. Most times. Now, here's how I wanted to go about doing this playthrough. I have various ways in which Peter can make money. Some are fair and honest, while others feel a little exploitative and possibly above his courage level. I'll alternate between a fair income and a quote, fight the system sort of income. For starters, it appears as though Peter had some really tight connections. He's free from jail, and all of a sudden, all of his relatives have passed away, local settlements need his help, and everyone needs some kind of favor. These of course are the plugins and player home DLCs. Don't worry, I'll get into the back-breaking hard work real soon, but this one was just too good not to mention. While Peter doesn't like to abuse his privilege, He understands a good deal when he sees one. In total, 3 of the newly added player homes could be ransacked. Now, without any of the upgrades or house additions, they're pretty barren. There isn't a lot going on inside of them. However, each one has something for the taking, and let's just say they're all pretty lucrative. Starting off with Frostcrag Spire, Peter gets access to the wizard tower that was previously owned by his relative or secret admirer or grandpa, and from there he can start spending money to make it livelier. However, Peter's smarter than that. He knows a good deal when he sees one, and oh boy, the smell of gold is in the air. Again, the tower is barren. There really isn't much in there except for one thing, a botanical garden containing over 130 of the game's flora. Plants from different regions of Cyrodiil, and even plants from Oblivion's Deadlands. Some of them are worth 1 gold per, and some are valued at over 5 gold per. Obviously, not every harvest is successful, but if Peter is able to snag at least 65 of the samples, that's a good start for his pocket. Now, next up for the plugins is the Fighter Stronghold. Whoever can help end the siege on Battlehorn Castle will earn the deed of the castle itself. If only real life was that simple. Actually, maybe not. I wouldn't want some rando challenging me to a duel for my home. While Peter sees $signs at Battlehorn, there's one huge issue with the castle. It's currently under attack, and Pete's not a fighter. What's more, even the road to the castle has many dangers on it, so he has to think fast and somewhat bravely. Booking it past the bandits and beelining it for Battlehorn, he lays eyes on the marauders outside the fort's walls. Once they saw him, they aggroed on, and it was officially do or die. Luckily, Peter's the man with a plan. Cutting the enemies around the grounds, I peeked at the fallen soldiers' inventories and saw money bags. Steel armor and weapons, well-made clothing, it was like a drop-off donation box. Eventually, the castle gates opened up and Battlehorn men-at-arms began rushing out. As they distracted the marauders, Pete ducked inside the castle and shut the gates behind him. This essentially made him unreachable and he could loot the castle in peace. Now, I'll call a spade, looting corpses might not be the most honorable. It isn't stealing, I didn't kill anyone, and otherwise the gear is just gonna sit there. However, taking from the dead opens up a whole can of worms of what's right and wrong. For the most part, Pete doesn't want to ruffle any feathers and prefers hard, honest work. While looting the dead doesn't pop up often during this playthrough, you will see some potentially morally gray forms of income coming up. Also, I don't like the idea of sending Pete into danger. Most of Oblivion's citizens stay away from threats and adventures, and without any combat prowess, Pete should be one of those people. Rest assured, very few of these business ventures actually involve him being brave. Once the siege was up and the castle belonged to Pete, it was time to reap the rewards. For starters, the weapons and armor are always worth a pretty penny. Even though they weigh a ton and call for frequent trips to the merchant, something I'll get into shortly, they're definitely worth the effort. Next up is what's actually inherited from Battlehorn Castle. With the fort comes all of the miscellaneous goods. Sitting on tables, resting on the ground, hiding in containers, and lined up in sacks, there was a plethora of goods that were just waiting to be taken. Food, supplies, books, materials, ingredients, gems, and good old-fashioned gold. The castle is humongous, and there are plenty of things to take from its, shall we say, estate sale. The men-at-arms are hawking at Pete, waiting for the garrison's next move, and Pete's just filling his pockets with books and stuffing his breeches with lettuce. I bet they're regretting the terms of ownership transfer. Anyways, once Battlehorn Castle was all wrapped up, it was on to the third and final helpful DLC, the Vile Lair. You see, Peter's relative, secret admirer, or grandpa, Greywind Blenwith, just left him this dark, dank, horrible, satanic lair to live in and operate out of. Fun, right? Peter was no lord, nor was he a wizard, but he's certainly not a murderer. However, times are tough, and if Pete can earn enough gold to buy a lakefront property, I'd say he's doing alright in this world. In terms of obvious loot, Deepscorn Hollow probably has the least of it. This place has things like skulls and rotten limbs, truly just things that someone like Thorinir would buy. The extremely rare perch salts don't have any value either, because why would anyone care about an instant cure for vampirism? And the rest of the place is mostly empty. However, Peter's got decent eyes, and looking around the place, he stumbled onto 4 hidden treasure caches. These were left behind by Greywind himself. The caches contain gold and a variety of rare gems. It's enough to make the everyday commoner jump and clack their feet together. What started as a sketchy walkthrough turned into a very fruitful tour. Thanks, Uncle Greywind. With cuirasses shoved into Pete's trousers, gems popping out of his linen cloth, and books lining his tucked-in shirt, it's time to start making a profit. As a working class citizen, you either perform services, specialize in a trade, or work the markets. To be frank, working the markets is how Pete makes about 75% of his wealth this playthrough. He may not be a brave warrior, but dealing with people is his forte. Almost all vendors specialize in certain goods. Some prefer weapons and armor, others like jewelry, and a select few prioritize junk. I tried working with a great deal of merchants, but to be honest, I found the best method is to stick with someone who buys and sells all manner of goods. From there, you boost their disposition, haggle for the best deal possible, and remain a loyal customer. Really, the biggest advantages are that you don't have to worry about a jeweler not wanting your ingredients and an alchemist not wanting your daggers. It cuts down on the back and forth, and with fast traveling at Pete's disposal, an extra 10 seconds of travel time is nothing. Plus, you also don't have to worry about raising every new vendor's disposition. By the end of Pete's looting, he had enough to afford his dream home. A small, musty, poorly built wooden shack on the capital's harborfront. It's not much, but it's semi-honest work. Now, I get it. I understand. Not every Cyrodiilic citizen has 4 different estates handed to them at once. Not everyone is privileged with trust funds, hand-me-downs, and unlimited goods for sale. Sometimes the average Joe has to go out there with their own 2 hands and make a living. Scavenging is something that's been done since the beginning of time. Going out and picking berries, fruits, flowers, buds, petals, leaves, you name it. It's so simple, but so effective. What's more, Pete doesn't have to look far for these ingredients. Most of the time, he's able to leave the city limits and wander down a road. He can find all sorts of harvestable plants on the roadside. Again, using them to brew potions would be a lot more lucrative. But for the most part, simply picking the flora and selling it off to a vendor works wonders. There are ample ingredients everywhere. Even the safe cities and cozy settlements have ingredients for the taking. I will say though, it's best to be cautious while out on the road. Even though these paths are safer than the woods and fields, and legionnaires do patrol them, dangers are everywhere, and you never know which moment could be your last. Now, a level up from scavenging is farming. Purposefully planted crops that can be harvested and sold by Cyrodiil's hardworking farmers. Well, you see, this part is a bit awkward. Even though these farms are owned by people, Oblivion considers their crops to be fair game. So while these hardworking citizens of the Empire are tilling the land, breaking their back until the sun comes up, Peter's able to just walk on up and pluck it from the earth. No one bats an eye, and they're not considered stolen goods. These fruits and vegetables can be sold to vendors, and the profit margins are pretty incredible. It might be one of the safest ways to earn a living in Cyrodiil. However, Peter is no scammer, and he recognizes that the system is only as good as the cogs that make it turn. So, think of this like a delivery service. Pete harvests the crops, sells them to a vendor, and then gives a portion of the gold to the farmer via bribes. This way, everyone wins. Say what you will about the cuts and portions, but these farmers already have their life. Pete's still trying to make ends meet. Now, taking things a step further, there's taking the city supplies and selling them back to them. This one, in theory, is stranger, and listen, I know how it sounds, but hear me out for a second. Among others, the Imperial City has a plethora of containers, crates, and sacks just laying around. 90% of them aren't owned by anyone, but somehow there are things stored inside of them. Think of this like reselling. They're tools, supplies, food, and materials that the city just forgot about. That's what we're going to go with anyways. Since there's no way to simply return them to the Empire or the Watch, Pete can take advantage of the situation and sell them to the city's vendors. This way, these items get reinvested back into the Imperial City's citizens as new owners will come along and purchase them for themselves. Don't get me wrong, while it's not considered stealing, it does feel scummy knowing that these do belong to someone. Since we don't know who exactly, it's best to make the best out of it, but the idea of it isn't lost on me. Now, let's go ahead and wrap up the scavenging section of this video. I'm actually not the biggest fan of this final method, but I think it deserves to be mentioned. Peter the Peasant isn't the bravest guy in the world. In fact, if he was, he'd probably be an adventurer and/or hero. With that being said though, everyone in a fantasy universe thinks about plundering the world's dungeons, braving the dank depths and ancient spaces in search of a life-changing treasure. A little bit of courage in exchange for financial freedom. Who wouldn't want that? So why can't Pete have the same dream and even make some attempts at it? Of course, Peter won't be fighting. He's simply not built like that. But the everyday civilian knows how to be sort of sneaky and at the end of the day can at least run for their lives. Pete can start off each dungeon crawl with sneaking his way around the dark corridors. If he's lucky, he might even make it past one or two of the enemies. However, when things inevitably go south, the steed's star sign kicks in and the engines turn on. It's do or die, fight or flight. Pete's able to whip around the chamber. He can shove weapons in his crevices, fill his pockets with oversized boots, hold gems in the corner of his mouth, and slips loose gold pieces in his moccasins. When things become a little too much, it's then time to escape the dungeon and outrun his assailants. Again, I'm not the biggest fan of this technique. While it's lucrative and arguably more honest than some of the previous methods, it teeters the line on a stealth playthrough, and the average citizen probably wouldn't put themselves in harm's way like that. While this is probably as crazy as it gets, there are just a couple more business models that are as desperate and dangerous as this one. Those will be coming up shortly. Alright, now it's time to completely switch gears. So far, there have been handouts, scavenging, crop delivery, reselling, and straight up plundering. What could possibly come next, other than the obvious? Well, I'm glad you asked, because up next is some good old-fashioned gambling. Luckily, Cyrodiil allows the common folk to place bets on arena combatants. Typically, these common folk have some extra income that they're willing to lose. Unfortunately, Peter isn't really in that tax bracket just yet. Any money lost is a hard hit, and any gold earned is spent on the next meal. It's reckless, addictive, and a poor financial decision. However, when he wins big, there's no other feeling quite like it for Peter. Watching your combatant pulverize the other, getting congratulated by Hundelin, and receiving your earnings is a dopamine overload. It's a rush, and the odds aren't even that bad. They're 50-50. 100 gold can quickly turn to 200, and before you know it, you're up by a lot. On the other hand, that last bit of change, necessary to one's survival, can be gone in an instant. Since there's no way to predict the arena, believe me, I've tried and made a video about it, the odds are completely random and it's not sustainable. While it's certainly legal and not really looked down upon, there are better ways to make a living. Better yet, there are easier ways of making a living. It's time to get into the real meat and potatoes of this playthrough. Before, I mentioned there are 3 ways a commoner can make a living in Tamriel. There are definitely more, but for the sake of this video, they're learning a trade, which I did but didn't actually use, working the markets, which was definitely done, and lastly, being of service to others. This, of course, is questing. Don't get me wrong, most quests in Oblivion involve some form of danger or threat. There are often fetch quests or bounty hunting jobs that lead to violence and death. Both are generally no-nos for Peter. However, there are a select few that revolve mostly around the player's personality and work ethic. For starters, there's Canvass the Castle. The Countess of Coral needs Peter to do some investigative work. Since he's a third party and has no biases, Pete should have no problem with finding the portrait thief and turning them into the Countess. All it takes are some speechcraft checks and a little bit of common sense. Then there's Corruption and Conscience over in Shadenhall. Working quietly with the city and getting input from the citizens, Pete was able to overthrow a corrupt watch captain, Ulrich Leland. Together with Leith Wavrick, he found evidence of Ulrich's unjust fines and turned him over to the law. On the same note, there's Imperial Corruption. Chatting with Rustlin about his recent shakedown, Peter was able to get the full story from Jensine. After approaching another guard captain and hearing what needed to be done, he convinced 2 witnesses to step forward and testify against Auden Zavidius. Even though this quest doesn't have any monetary reward, it helped Peter's reputation in the big city. Up next is a pretty good one, and it loops back around to the whole scavenging business model. After picking up his first sample of Nirnroot, Peter was curious as to what the plant's origins were. After visiting an alchemist, he was directed to Sindarion over in Skingrad. This, of course, is the quest, Seeking Your Roots. Sindarion tells Peter to come back after securing 10 samples of the plant. This is actually pretty easy. The alchemist sends you to a little pond that contains 3 of them. The rest of his samples can easily be acquired by running along riverbanks and shorelines. Nirnroot grows by water, and honestly, just picking a direction and hugging the shore, you're bound to come across a whole bunch. I'd say in my case, I was finding a Nirnroot every minute or so. What's more, really the only threat that Pete had to worry about were mud crabs, and those could easily be ran past. After collecting 10 samples, Sindarion takes them from Peter and brews a weak elixir of exploration. This can then be sold back to the alchemist for a minor sum of gold. Really, the money starts flowing when the stronger variations of potions are brewed. These have a higher base value, but require higher amounts of Nirnroot to make. Eventually, when the potions come to an end, Sindarion just gives in and starts paying 250 gold per 10 Nirnroot. In total, there are 300 samples of the unique plant in the game, so there's lots of money to be made here. Up next is the quest Separated at Birth. This one is arguably the easiest of the service-based quests. After chatting with a drunk Randall Germain and Coral, he gives Peter 50 gold to seek out his imposter in Shadenhall. From here, you technically don't have to go through with it, as the reward was already paid out. However, in order to put the honest in honest living, Pete took the 5 minutes out of his day and sought out Reynold's imposter, aka his long-lost twin brother, Gilbert. The reunion brings on the rest of their questline, but it's far beyond Pete's skill level. Then lastly, for the wholesome, simple service-based quests, there's zero visibility. The settlement of Ayleswell has a bit of a problem. They've been turned invisible by the resident wizard, Ankatar. Ankatar lives in the fort right beside the settlement. All Pete has to do is tell the mage that his experiment affected the locals and that they need some sort of cure for their invisibility. Ankatar gives Pete a scroll as well as a ring of protection. While this does involve the arcane arts, the beauty of scrolls is that the user doesn't need any knowledge of magic to use them. You just sort of say what's written down and then the magic happens. At least that's what I think. Doing so, the town was made visible again, and while the proprietor didn't reward Pete with gold, he did offer a free place to stay while on the road. Now, branching off a bit, there's a subcategory of quests that I like to call taking advantage of others' good nature. These are quests that give the player certain perks, things they can use and abuse. For example, the second quest in the main storyline, Deliver the Amulet, has the hero of Kvatch headed to Waynon Priory. After telling Joffrey about your mission and being sent off to Kvatch, you can ask for handouts from the monks. Joffrey gifts Peter with sets of armor, weapons, and potions. The resale value on these pieces are pretty nice. The other two monks give pretty meh gifts. Brother Piner hands Peter a book, which is only worth 25 or so gold, and Brother Maberel gives Pete a horse, which is admittedly kind of cool. What's more, and is a bonus segment, you can further take advantage of other people's kindness by bringing the steed to Chestnut Handy Stables. After chatting with Snakrabura, you'll get free horse armor. Again, it's not gold, but you do get to ride around Cyrodiil in style. Up next for taking advantage of people is joining the various factions of Cyrodiil. By asking to be taken into the Fighters Guild, the Mages Guild, and even the Arena, Peter gets access to all sorts of items. Most of these items are considered free game and don't belong to anyone. Therefore, the resale value is incredible, and it's not stealing. Admittedly, the Arena is a little more on the limited side. The player can only get a hold of a handful of weapons. Once those are sold, that's pretty much it for the Bloodworks. However, the Fighters Guild halls and Mages Guild halls are where the real money's at. The former has all sorts of miscellaneous goods, like books, materials, and food. However, it also has its fair share of weapons and armor. These are rather plentiful and can even be sold back to the hall's blacksmith. Then there are the Mages Guild halls, which in my opinion are even more fruitful. They have the same sort of miscellaneous goods, books, ingredients, potions, you name it. However, the big coin comes from the alchemy supplies. Mortar and pestles, calcinators, retorts, and alembics. These have hefty resale prices and are a dime a dozen at each hall. Then, if you're really lucky, you'll also come across soul gems that can be pawned off for really good value. Essentially, there's no downside or commitment to joining these factions. Sure, you're taking advantage of their hospitality and open door policy, but it's also about looking out for the little guy, right? As this playthrough comes to an end, the final business model that Peter the Peasant could stink up involves some bravery or stupidity and morally gray thinking. They're quests that teeter the line. To me, they're among the safest ones that involve danger and potential crime. Some include threats to his life, while others involve turning a blind eye to some possible buffoonery. Essentially, these are more like scams, MLMs, or lack of safety jobs that Cyrodiil has to offer. Kind of, not really. In any case, the first of the bunch is a venerable vintage. Admittedly, when I included this one on the list, I forgot one of the most important parts of it. The Shadow Banished wine can only be found in Cyrodiil's old forts. These forts are of course occupied by the worst that the province has to offer. So, in a similar fashion to plundering, Peter had to sneak and sprint his way through these dungeons. Often, the bottles of Shadow Banish were located in the final zones of a lot of these forts, so it's safe to say that his adrenal glands were overactive. Most of the target dungeons offer 2 bottles of wine, so all Peter needed was 3 dangerous expeditions. After 6 bottles of Shadow Banish were secured, Narissa paid him out 1,000 gold, which honestly is the highest reward from any of these quests. She also offers to pay 100 gold per extra bottle brought in, so if he feels like risking it all some more, there's always making a living off of fetching wine. The next task is Raid on Greyland. I included this one because it's actually incredibly simple. Chatting with the Legionnaire outside of Leeuwin, he wants Pete to kill Kylius Lenavo, a skooma dealer that's been on the run. Kylius and his associate are held up in Greyland, a small manor that's just up the road. Again, the business model here requires some courage or stupidity. As a great man once said, it's time to nut up or shut up. All Pete has to do is enter Greyland and grab the skooma dealer's attention. From there, he drags them back to the Legionnaire, Lorexis, and lets him do the dirty work. Once Kalidas has killed his own targets, Pete can grab Lenavo's ring and present it for a reward. Again, it's a scam if I've ever seen one, but Lorexis is apparently none the wiser. The final quest included on this list is Paranoia. This one is definitely an interesting entry. There's a couple of different ways to approach it. Glarther of Skingrad asks Peter to spy on 3 different citizens. He believes that they're watching him and are part of some sort of conspiracy. Peter has some options here. He can do what Glarther wants and spy on the targets. This way, he's doing the service that he was paid for. He'll also learn that no one's spying on the Wood Elf and that his employer's a nutcase. Or, if Peter was rather scummy, he could wait 24 hours for the meetup and lie to Glarther by telling him whatever he'd like. Depending on Pete's responses, he could end up with a lot of gold, but people will die and it's far from honest hard work. I like the headcanon of Pete thinking that he's helping Glarther. He spies on the targets but quickly realizes that nothing's going on. Telling Glarther the truth, he flies into a frenzy and Pete gets the help of the local guard. This way, Peter the Peasant gets to keep the money he made, but there's no final blood money reward. Well, I'm sure there are other ways to make a living in modern day Cyrodiil, ways that don't involve death, destruction, or violence. But for now, Peter the Peasant is content with his life. He has a waterfront property, food on the table, a roof over his head, and a bed to lay down in. Sometimes, we don't need a grand adventure to be happy, nor do we need to save the world. Sometimes, waking up and knowing that you have food, shelter, and security is all it takes. Until next time, keep on staying within the city limits and not risking your life.